Tonight's story is a quiet one, to a time when people believed that sins could be eaten, quite literally, by someone brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to carry them. In this calming journey, you've just been hired as a sin eater. What that means, how your life would unfold, and the strange peace that came with it, will be told slowly, gently, and with enough stillness to help you drift into rest. So find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, if you'd like, and let your mind settle. If you enjoy these peaceful stories from the past, feel free to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps the stories flowing. And while you're here, let me know down in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Wherever you are, I hope this story keeps you company. Let's begin. So, here you are. Welcome. You've been hired, you've been offered a job. And let's just say, it's not your average career path. There's no desk, no uniform, no monthly salary, not even a polite welcome letter, or a manual for new employees. Instead, your first day begins with the soft, unsettling silence of death. You are now a sin eater, and this job, it isn't one you applied for. Nobody dreams of becoming a sin eater when they're a child, running through meadows, or playing with pebbles in the village square. It's the kind of profession that finds you when times are hard, when your belly is empty, and when your name isn't called in church nearly as often as the others. You're not quite an outcast, but you're not exactly welcome either. You exist in the quiet margin between the sacred and the unwanted, and it's a very sleepy kind of space to be. Let me take you through your first day. It's early morning, mist clings to the hedgerows like an old shawl. You've walked 2 villages over, boots still damp from the last rain. The path curves through low stone walls, past leaning crosses and crooked barns. It's quiet except for the distant bleat of a sheep, or the rustle of crows in a leafless tree. You carry nothing but a woolen coat, a pouch with a few coins, and the knowledge passed down to you by someone older. Maybe it was your grandfather. Maybe it was a wandering man who once passed you bread and said only, "Eat slow, let the soul settle." You step through the wooden gate and enter the cottage. It smells of beeswax and damp straw. A candle flickers low beside a body, an old woman wrapped in linen, her face peaceful, eyes closed as if still listening. On a small wooden plate resting upon her chest is a slice of bread. Near her hands, a cup of ale. These are your tools. You sit beside her gently. Everyone else has already left the room. That's part of the custom. You must be alone for this part, not because it's holy, but because no one wants to be near you when you do it. You pick up the bread. It's rough and dry, maybe barley, maybe rye. You chew slowly, thoughtfully. There's no rush. You sip the ale. It's dark and bitter, but warm going down. With each bite, you're told you're taking her sins into yourself. Every harsh word, every angry thought, every missed church visit, every little trespass of life, all of it seeps into you like ink into cloth. No one speaks while you do this. No one watches, but they believe. Oh, they believe with all their might. And belief is a powerful thing. When you're done, you whisper a small prayer, not the official kind, not the church's words, but something old and muttered and half forgotten, the kind of phrase that lives in the bones of people, passed quietly from one generation to the next, like a bedtime lullaby, or a charm against the dark. I take thy sins upon me, dear soul. Sleep now, and come no more among the living. That's it. That's the ritual. You rise. You step outside. The villagers avert their eyes. One tosses you a coin without touching your hand. Another sets down a heel of bread beside the gate, and backs away like you're made of smoke. You are not one of them anymore. Not fully. You've eaten what they fear. You've taken what they refuse. And now, you walk back into the mist. Let's pause and breathe, shall we? That was just your first task, and though it might feel strange, almost unreal, you'll come to learn it is far from unique. Sin eaters like you have existed across the British Isles, mostly in the borderlands between England and Wales, in the quiet shadows of crumbling hills and half-forgotten chapels. You're not a priest, you're not a doctor, you're not even particularly spiritual. You're just willing to sit with the dead when no one else will, willing to be paid in scraps and sips, willing to shoulder invisible things, and willing to walk away quietly afterward. Not many people can say the same. It's not a job with prestige. No one writes ballads about you. There are no statues, no sermons in your honor, but there's something strangely sacred about the simplicity of it, something profoundly human. You're part of a ritual older than memory, a thread in the fabric of mourning, a strange solemn placeholder for peace. And the best part, there's no paperwork. Now that you've eaten your first sin, let's talk about how this peculiar tradition even came to be. How did people arrive at the idea that bread and ale could transfer guilt, that a stranger could consume shame like stew, that silence could substitute for ceremony? Let's take a slow walk back through time together, gently with warm tea in hand and no need to hurry, but we'll save that for chapter 2. Close your eyes for a moment, if you'd like. Let the flickering candlelight fade behind your lids. You've done good work today, and you'll need your rest. After all, there are always more sins to eat. So, you've eaten your first sin, and now, as your feet crunch softly along the leaf-strewn path back toward the edge of town, you can't help but wonder, how did this all begin? How did a simple act like eating bread beside the dead become a tradition steeped in awe, fear, and quiet necessity? The truth is, no one really knows for sure. Like many of the oldest things, sin-eating was never formally written into books or laws. It wasn't part of church doctrine. It didn't appear in official scrolls. It simply appeared, somewhere in the spaces between belief and need, not in the grand cathedrals, but in the dusty corners of rural cottages, not in the Latin tongues of priests, but in the murmurs of midwives and grave diggers. And so tonight, as the wind rustles gently through the hedgerows, you walk and remember the stories told to you, the quiet inheritance passed from mouth to mouth, hearth to hearth. Let's go back, far back, long before anyone called it sin-eating. People believed that death left something behind, not just a body, not just sadness, but something heavier, a kind of residue, a weight. You might call it a soul that hadn't quite found the door, or perhaps a stain left behind from all the sorrows of a life. In ancient times, they believed in many spirits. Not all were friendly. When someone died, the living would often whisper charms over the body, or burn herbs beside the bed, or open windows wide to let the spirit escape. They'd avoid moving the corpse too soon, and cover mirrors in the home, and keep a single candle lit, not just for the sake of light, but to guide the soul away. They didn't want the dead to linger, not out of cruelty, but because they feared what might happen if that lingering soul became restless. And so began a long line of customs designed to help the dead move on. One of the oldest such customs came from ancient Israel. In the biblical book of Leviticus, a ritual was described where a goat would be symbolically burdened with the sins of the people. The priest would place his hands upon its head, naming the wrongs of the community. Then the goat, now the scapegoat, would be sent into the wilderness, carrying all that uncleanliness away. The people watched it vanish into the distance, and with it, they hoped went their guilt. Strange to think, isn't it, that the act of laying blame upon a creature and then banishing it could feel so relieving? But humans are creatures of symbol, and symbols, well, they can be more powerful than swords or sermons. Centuries passed, beliefs shifted, religions came and went, but the idea of transferring spiritual burden to something else, that lingered. And by the time you, the sin-eater, came into being, somewhere around the 1600s in the borderlands of England and Wales, this symbolic logic had already soaked deep into the bones of rural tradition. In those times, especially in poorer villages far from city churches, people didn't always trust that the clergy would come when needed. Roads were bad, priests were expensive, sometimes the only person who could offer a final blessing was you. So when a loved one died, especially if they hadn't confessed their sins properly, or died suddenly, or had lived a life that strayed from church rules, families would quietly call upon a sin-eater. They wouldn't advertise it. It wasn't written on signs or said out loud in the market, but word would get around. A cousin would whisper it to a neighbor, A friend would pass it along in hushed tones by the well, and then, as if summoned by the very breath of grief, you would arrive, you with your worn boots, and your tired eyes, and your empty stomach. You'd come not just to eat food, but to eat meaning. You'd eat bread placed on the chest of the corpse, sometimes broken into small pieces and left for hours before you arrived. You'd drink a small portion of ale, or mead, or in rare cases, milk or wine. These weren't meant for your enjoyment, they were the vessels of sin. By touching the body, by eating food that had touched the dead, you were said to draw out the guilt, the regret, the secrets, everything left undone in life. It wasn't just about belief, it was about comfort. A grieving daughter might weep, but if she saw you eat, if she watched you take her father's sins into yourself, she could sleep better that night. She could imagine her father, now free of weight, walking gently toward heaven, the path cleared by your mouth, your belly, your bones. It was transactional, yes, you'd be given bread, or coin, or a place to sleep for the night, but more than that, it was deeply symbolic, a way of making peace. And unlike the church, which preached with fire and brimstone, you offered something quieter. No judgment, no ritual washing, no ceremony or incense or psalms, just bread, and stillness, and silence. Of course not everyone approved. The church called it superstition, priests frowned upon it, some declared it heretical, others simply ignored it, not wanting to challenge the traditions of rural folk who wouldn't listen anyway. But despite the disapproval, sin-eating survived, quietly, in small towns and highland villages, in crofts and cottages, wherever faith met fear and love met loss. And like all the best traditions, it was mostly passed down in whispers, from father to son, from midwife to mourner, from the hungry to the desperate. You became a sin-eater not through schooling, but through circumstance. No one asked you to sign a paper, no one gave you a robe, you simply arrived, and ate, and prayed. So now, as you walk deeper into the hills, let's think about what you carry. You carry more than bread, you carry a history of rituals meant to ease the fear of death, a history of human hearts trying to make sense of the end, a history of people who wanted more than anything, to believe that their loved ones were forgiven, that their wrongs could be wiped clean, that something as small as a crust of bread and a sip of ale could be enough to say, "It's okay, you may go in peace." And you, sin-eater, you were the one who said it, not in words, but in action. You said it with your appetite, with your presence, with your simple quiet willingness to carry what others could not. And that, perhaps, is the most sacred part of all. Now rest a moment, let the wind ease, let the trail level out. We'll walk again soon. Next I'll tell you what the ritual of sin-eating actually looked like, step by slow step, from the knocking at the door, to the bite of bread, to the way people watched you leave like a shadow slipping into dusk. But for now, close your eyes, if you'd like. Feel the mist settle on your shoulders, hear the soft bell in the distance. You've done well, it's just before twilight, the kind of pale bluish hour, where the day seems reluctant to end. A soft fog curls along the road, as you make your way toward a small cottage. The house is modest, wattle walls, a slanted thatched roof, smoke trailing gently from the chimney like an exhale. Tonight you've been called, someone has died. You weren't invited with words, exactly. The invitation was more of a quiet understanding, a knock sent through neighbors, a whispered request through a friend of a friend. You never really arrive, you simply appear, on foot like a shadow stepping out of the dusk. There's no crowd to greet you, only silence, a bowed head at the door. The widow opens it slowly, as if even the creak of the hinges should be respectful. She does not speak, she doesn't need to. You know what to do. You step inside, it's warm in the cottage, a fire hums in the hearth, orange and soft, the scent of rosemary hangs in the air, faint but familiar. It's often used to cover the smell of illness, or to honor the dead. On the table near the fire, you notice a pitcher of ale, and beside it, a small trencher of bread, coarse, heavy, likely baked with barley or oats. Across the room, the body lies still, wrapped in a blanket, or perhaps in a burial shroud, face uncovered, eyes gently closed. A waxy stillness clings to the features. Around the head, someone has placed sprigs of herbs, lavender, rue and thyme, not for show, but for tradition, for protection, for peace. And resting upon the chest, a single piece of bread. It's not a loaf, it's not seasoned or sweetened, just a thick slice, plain, dense, heavy with meaning. This is where the ritual begins. You remove your hat, not out of piety, but out of quiet respect. Then you sit beside the bier, not on a chair, but on a small wooden stool, low to the ground, close to the earth, closer to the dead. There's no priest, no choir, no scripture, only you, and the quiet, and that is enough. You reach out slowly, with clean hands, always clean. You lift the bread from the corpse's chest. It's cool to the touch, perhaps slightly damp from the air. You place it on a small wooden board beside you. Next you pour the ale into a chipped mug. The mug may have once belonged to the deceased. That's common. This is not a meal, it is a transfer, and every movement must be careful, deliberate, slow. Then, the prayer. There are many versions, none officially written. Each sin-eater has his own, passed down by memory, changed slightly with time. Yours goes like this: I eat this bread, I drink this ale, so that the soul of name may rest. I take upon me all that was left behind, the anger, the sorrow, the trespass, the weight. May they find peace, may they walk free, may they come not again in this world. Amen. Sometimes you say the name aloud, sometimes you do not. It depends on the family. Some prefer silence, some want to hear the name spoken one last time. A final tether, gently untied. You take your first bite. The bread is dense, dry. It doesn't taste of anything in particular. But that's not the point. This isn't about flavor. It's about meaning, about symbolism, about the act. With each bite, you imagine the sins being drawn out, not in a dramatic way, no lightning, no ghostly winds, but softly, as if the bread were a sponge soaking up regret, or perhaps, as if it were absorbing what remains. You chew slowly, thoughtfully. Then, a sip of ale. It burns, just a little, stronger than you expected. Some families use spiced mead or cider instead, others use milk, if they can't afford anything stronger. Tonight it's ale, thick and dark and bitter. You drink deeply. There is no rush. Time moves differently here, as if the walls themselves are watching, as if the dead are listening. You finish the bread, then the rest of the ale, and place the cup gently on the floor. There is no applause, no thanks, just a silence that feels slightly lighter. The air changes. You feel it in your shoulders. The family enters once more, slowly, from another room. No one looks you directly in the eye. That's part of the custom. They may nod, they may offer a coin or two, pressed gently into your palm, or perhaps a hot meal in the back, waiting by the hearth, or perhaps nothing. You do not complain. You stand, you bow your head slightly, not in reverence, but in acknowledgement, and then you walk outside. The ritual is complete, but its meaning lingers. You've just acted as a symbolic scapegoat. You've taken the weight, and while you may not feel any different physically, spiritually, there's a quiet heaviness that follows you down the lane. Some say you carry these sins for life, that they cling to your spirit like soot. Others believe the sins fade over time, dissolving like mist in morning sun. You're not entirely sure, but the bread always sits heavy in your belly. This is what it means to be a sin eater, not a magician, not a priest, just a man, quiet, hungry, humble, who helps the dead rest a little easier, not through miracles, not through sermons, but through a simple act of eating. In some villages, the ritual includes other touches: a candle lit near the head, a bell rung outside the house, a sprig of rosemary tucked behind your ear. In others it's even simpler, no words, just bread, eaten in silence. Some families lay coins on the eyes of the dead, as payment for the afterlife. Some bury the plate the bread was on, believing it carries a trace of sin. Some burn the mug, after your final sip. It varies, region to region, house to house, but the purpose is always the same: to release, to forgive, to cleanse, and to let go. You walk now through twilight, the sky soft with stars, a thin sliver of moon follows you, a cool wind brushes your collar, and though your steps are slow, there is peace in your gait. You've done your duty, you've performed the ritual, you've eaten the sins of another, and lived to tell the tale. In our next chapter, we'll explore what happens after the ritual, how people treat you, where you sleep, what others say behind your back, and why your role, though necessary, places you forever on the edge of society. But for now, sleep. Let the bread settle, let your eyes grow heavy, let the quiet take you. You are the sin eater, and this is your path. Morning comes slowly, the mist lifts from the fields, the air smells of damp moss and warming earth. You wake beneath a low-hanging thatch, in a barn the villagers allowed you to use. It isn't much, just a pile of straw, a woolen blanket, and your cloak rolled into a makeshift pillow. A chicken clucks somewhere outside, a cow shifts in its pen. The world returns to motion, but not for you. You remain still a little longer, listening. You've just performed the ritual, you've eaten the sins of another, and now, the village stirs without you. It always does. You rise slowly, no one greets you, there's no handshake, no hot breakfast waiting, no curious child tugging at your sleeve to ask what death tastes like. No one meets your eye when you pass. In fact, most step slightly aside. They pretend to be busy, fixing a fence, sweeping a stoop, carrying a bucket that doesn't really need moving. You understand, it isn't cruelty, it's fear. Not the kind of fear that makes people scream or run. The other kind, the quiet, deeply rooted fear. The kind people inherit without ever knowing when or how. The kind whispered from grandmother to grandchild, like don't look too long at the sin eater. He carries the weight. To them you're not quite clean, not physically. You bathe like everyone else, but spiritually, symbolically. You've touched the untouchable. You've stood closer to the dead than the priest. You've swallowed what no one else dares name. You've become a living reminder of everything they fear, and for that, they keep their distance. So where do you go? That depends. Some sin eaters have a cottage at the edge of town. Some live alone on the moor, near old stones, or the ruins of a church long abandoned. Some sleep under the stars, wrapped in layers of wool and quiet thoughts. You walk a lot. You learn the paths between villages, the back ways, the bramble trails and muddy ditches. You know which woods are safe and which streams freeze late. You become a student of silence, a wanderer, not always by choice, but by necessity. You get used to eating alone. You learn to like it. A hunk of cheese on a rock by the river, a piece of bread softened with rain, a flask of ale tucked into your coat. The birds don't judge. The trees don't stare. The moss makes a good cushion. You come to prefer it, not because you dislike people, but because people have rules, unspoken ones, and you, dear sin eater, are the one who steps outside them. Children whisper stories about you. They say you talk to ghosts, that you don't sleep, that you can see death before it comes, that you eat more than bread, that sometimes you take teeth, or hearts, or hair. None of it's true, but that's how stories work. They fill in the blanks people are too afraid to ask about. So you become myth, a man, and more than a man, and somehow, less. There are moments of kindness, of course. A woman leaves bread near your path, wrapped in cloth, as if dropped by accident. A farmer tosses you a coin with a grunt instead of a word. A child too young to fear offers you a handful of wild berries, and only later is pulled away with a gasp by his mother. These moments shine. They are rare,
and precious, and you treasure them, but mostly your life is one of distance. You pass through towns like a breeze, here one moment, gone the next. You sleep wherever there's shelter, a dry barn, a crumbling wall, a hollow beneath an old oak. You learn the language of crows, the signs of weather. You become an expert in being forgotten, and yet, you're never quite invisible. People know when you're near. They don't call out, but they notice the silence grow deeper. They glance toward the churchyard a little more often. They tuck their children in with tighter blankets. Your presence is felt like fog, like something that arrives on soft feet and lingers just long enough to make the world quieter. You are the sin eater, a role both needed and shunned, a paradox wrapped in rough cloth, a servant of peace who walks in shadow, and it changes you. You grow quieter, slower, more thoughtful. You learn to observe rather than speak, to listen rather than be heard. You notice the way grief folds a person's shoulders, the way guilt lingers in a room like smoke, the way people breathe a little easier after the ritual, even if they never say thank you. You carry those things, like stones in your pocket, sometimes late at night, as you sit by your fire, sipping something warm and strong. You wonder if the sins stay with you, if you truly absorb them, if they leave marks on your spirit, tiny shadows beneath the skin. You wonder if that's why your dreams are so strange, why the wind sometimes seems to whisper names you don't remember knowing, why the birds quiet when you pass, but you don't dwell on it. You've learned not to. After all, there are more dead to tend to, and someone must carry what others cannot. Tomorrow another family will need you. Another door will open just enough to let you in. Another table will be set with bread and ale, and you will sit, and eat, and nod, and walk away. As always, in the next chapter we'll travel beyond your village, and beyond your country. You'll learn that the sin eater's role, while unique in name, has ancient cousins all around the world. People who like you stood between life and death, between guilt and grace, between memory and forgetting. But for now, rest. Your walk today was long. Let the quiet return. Let the fire dim. Let the world slow to the pace of your breath. You are a sin eater, and in your loneliness, you are never truly alone. Never truly alone. Never truly alone. Never truly.
You're not alone. Though you may walk quiet country roads and sleep beside fading embers, you are not the only one to have carried the invisible burdens of others. Long before your boots ever touched the mud of your village, long before your first loaf of sin-soaked bread, others in distant lands, speaking other tongues, performed their own strange rituals. Some ate, some buried, some whispered, some wept, but all of them carried. Tonight, as you rest your back against a mossy stone wall, watching the last streaks of gold fade from the sky, let me tell you about them. Let me take you far away, through foggy pastures and across oceans of time, to where other sin-eaters, though never called by that name, lived and breathed their own strange truths. The goat who carried guilt, ancient Israel. Let's begin where we hinted before. Thousands of years ago, in the desert lands of ancient Israel, the people gathered for a yearly ritual known as the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. 2 goats were chosen. One was sacrificed, but the other was sent away. The high priest would press his hands onto its head, speaking aloud the sins of the community. Every lie, every theft, every betrayal, everything left unsaid. And then, in silence, the goat was led into the wilderness, alone, carrying the weight of a nation. This was the origin of the word scapegoat, the idea that guilt, collective or personal, could be transferred, carried, removed. The goat was not a sinner, just a vessel, just like you. Feeding the dead, ancient Egypt far to the south, where the Nile slides slowly through the sand, the Egyptians practiced something different, but equally strange. They believed the dead needed food for the afterlife. Offerings were made at tombs, bread, fruit, wine and meat, not for the mourners, but for the spirit of the departed. Priests or family members would leave these gifts, whispering the name of the dead, encouraging the soul to feed, to regain strength for the journey ahead. Sometimes, the offerings would be eaten by priests. Symbolically, they were consuming on behalf of the spirit. a soft echo of your own ritual, where food becomes more than nourishment. It becomes a bridge. The ghost eaters of China. In ancient Chinese folk religion, rituals for the dead are extensive and deeply symbolic. Families burn paper replicas of money, clothing, and even houses, so that the dead may use them in the afterlife. But in some regions a specific ritual takes place when the dead are believed to have died with unrest, sudden, tragic, or violent deaths. A ritual called Shi Mei involved food and incense being placed before the spirit, and in some versions a medium or ritual specialist would symbolically eat the food on behalf of the ghost, taking its hunger, its frustration into themselves. It wasn't always called eating, sometimes it was breathing, sometimes just sitting beside the food, but the message was the same: we recognize your pain, let us carry it, so you may move on. Sound familiar? The cursed eaters of the Andes. Up high in the mountains of South America, among the Quechua people of the Andes, an ancient custom existed. When someone believed they had been cursed, or when a family member died unexpectedly, they would seek out a curandero or healer. Sometimes that healer would perform a ritual involving food. The afflicted person would prepare a meal, and the healer would eat it. As they ate, they would chant, pray, and breathe deeply, symbolically drawing out the illness or the sorrow into themselves. Then they would walk away, often alone, carrying the spiritual weight. Their payment? A few coins, a meal, and solitude, so much like your own. The arval bread of Wales closer to home. In your own windswept land, there was another tradition once whispered among mourners, the making of arval bread. After a person died, a large round loaf was baked and passed around the gathering. Each mourner took a bite. It wasn't about sustenance, it was about remembrance, about community, about sharing the weight. In some regions that same bread would be placed upon the chest of the deceased, just like in your ritual. Some say that's where your role came from, the arval loaf evolving into the sin-eater's bread. Who's to say? The line between mourning and magic is a soft one. The Buddhist Hungry Ghost Festival. Every summer, in parts of East Asia, a beautiful and eerie event takes place, the Hungry Ghost Festival. It is said that during this time the gates of the underworld open, and spirits wander the earth. Some are peaceful, others are not. To soothe them, families prepare feasts. They set places at the table. They leave bowls outside their homes. The food is not touched by the living. It is meant for the dead. In some traditions, monks are paid to chant while meals are offered. In others, symbolic eating occurs, the act of giving becoming more powerful than the act of consumption. Again you see it. The same idea: to feed, to soothe, to release, and always to carry. All across the world, across time, across oceans and languages and faiths, this pattern returns. The idea that sorrow, guilt, or spiritual unrest can be taken on through ritual, through food, through presence. You, the sin-eater, are just one face in this long procession. Not the first, not the last, but part of something old, something human, something sacred in its simplicity. And perhaps that's why, even when the church disapproved, people still called for you, because in the quiet space between grief and hope you offered something ancient, a reassurance that the burden could be shared, that the soul could be lightened, that bread and ale could carry meaning. In our next chapter we return home, to stories of real sin-eaters who once walked the earth as you do now, forgotten men in forgotten villages, quiet wanderers whose names were whispered long after their deaths. But for now, sit by the fire, listen to the wind outside, let the world fade softly, like the echo of an old song. You are the sin-eater, and you are not alone. The path you walk is lonely, but not new. Others have walked it before you, quietly, humbly, with the same weather-worn boots and the same pouch of coins that never felt heavy enough. Their names are mostly forgotten, erased by rain and time. But if you sit very still, if you listen closely, you can almost hear their footsteps in the mist. Tonight let's walk alongside them. Let's meet the ones who came before you, the real sin-eaters, flesh and bone, bread and ale, shadow and soul, the borderlands, where sin-eaters lingered. If you were to unroll a dusty old map and trace your finger along the border of England and Wales, somewhere between the crooked lanes and stone chapels, you'd find the marches. That's where sin-eating took root, not in London's glittering courts, not in the grand cathedrals of Canterbury or York, but in the windswept hills and tucked-away hamlets, places where the soil was poor, and the dead were buried quickly, and superstition clung tighter than ivy to stone. Here among low villages with names that whistle in the wind, people believed deeply in two things: that sin could cling to a soul after death, and that someone needed to take it away. That someone was you, or rather someone like you, a man who needed coin, a man with few ties, a man who would sit beside the dead and eat what others could not bear. Richard Munslow, the last known sin-eater. Let me tell you a name, a real one, Richard Munslow. He lived in the village of Rattling Hope, nestled in the hills of Shropshire, a place you'd almost miss if you blinked while passing. Richard wasn't a poor man. In fact, he was rather well off for his time, a landowner, a farmer, someone with enough to get by, and yet, he chose to perform the sin-eating ritual well into the late 1800s, long after most had stopped. Why? That's the mystery. Some say he began after the death of his children. Others say he saw it as a duty, a kindness, a tradition that needed keeping. He would walk to the homes of the newly dead, accept his loaf and ale, whisper his quiet prayer, and walk back through the mist as the villagers closed their doors behind him. His name was never sung, he wasn't praised, but he was remembered. And over a century later, in 2010, the villagers of Rattling Hope restored his gravestone. They cleared the weeds, recut the letters, laid flowers, not because he was famous, not because he asked, but because, deep down, they remembered what he gave: peace. They were all around, and yet hidden. There were others, hundreds, maybe thousands, but sin-eaters weren't recorded like mayors or bishops. They didn't have parishes. No census takers stopped to write professional, devourer of sin on their scroll, and so their names slipped into shadow. We know of them only from hints, a footnote here, a funeral account there, a sentence in the memoir of an old clergyman who frowned upon the old ways, and yet, the silence speaks volumes. These were men who lived on the fringe, invited in only when death had arrived, and ushered out the moment it was over. They were part of the ceremony, but never part of the family. They were necessary, but never truly welcome. They were the bridge, and yet they stood alone. How they lived: most lived in simple cottages, some in huts built from turf and stone. Some were wanderers, sleeping beneath hedgerows or in the barns of the very families they served. They didn't marry often. They rarely had children. They kept to themselves, not because they were antisocial, but because the weight of sin, even if symbolic, tends to gather like fog, and people fear what they don't understand. They made just enough to eat, enough to move on, enough to survive. Their possessions were few: a cloak, a walking stick, a pouch of salt, sometimes used in rituals, a loaf or two, wrapped in cloth, and perhaps a prayer written in no one's hand but their own. The death of the tradition. By the end of the 1800s, sin-eating began to fade. The church cracked down harder on pagan superstitions. Medicine began replacing folklore. Science crept into the corners of grief, and people stopped calling. It didn't happen all at once. Just, fewer doors opened, fewer coins dropped, fewer loaves were left on the chest of the dead, until one day, no one called at all, and the last sin-eater, perhaps Richard, or someone less remembered, stood alone beside a fire, bread in hand, and realized there was no more work. And so, the tradition passed into legend. But not for you, because tonight, as you listen to the wind outside your lean-to shelter, wrapped in your cloak, belly warm from borrowed ale, you remember them, you carry them with you, all of them, their stories, their silence, their bread, their burden. You are a sin-eater, the last in a long line, and tonight, you remember those who came before, not with ceremony, not with trumpets, but with breath, and with stillness, and with sleep. In Chapter 7, we'll shift from history to the deeply human, what it feels like inside, to carry what others refuse, the psychological burden, the dreams, the moments between ritual and reflection, what really happens when you eat sins. But for now, the fire is low, and your eyes grow heavy. Let the world go dim. You've walked far tonight. Rest now. You are the sin-eater, and the past walks with you. It's quiet again. The kind of quiet that fills the space behind your ears and settles into your bones. The kind of quiet that comes after a long walk home, after a ritual completed, after the fire has gone to embers, and the last voice has faded into the night. You sit alone, back pressed against a cool stone wall, knees tucked beneath your cloak, the scent of damp earth curling softly beneath your nose. The bread has been eaten,
The prayer has been whispered, and the family has gone back to their beds. But you remain awake, listening, thinking, feeling. No one ever tells you what it feels like. When you first become a sin eater, they explain the ritual, the bread, the ale, the prayer. They tell you how to stand, how to sit, how to leave without making noise, but they don't tell you what happens after, what happens inside, because something does happen, not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like fog creeping beneath a doorframe. You don't feel different at first. The first sin you eat, it's just bread, just ale, just a small weight in your stomach. But then, the dreams begin, not nightmares. Exactly, just strange images. A hand you don't recognize reaching toward you, a field of crows circling above a river, a child's voice saying your name, even though you're sure no child in that village ever learned it. You wake up with a faint ache in your chest, the kind that doesn't come from illness, but from memory, except, the memory isn't yours. And then, when you're awake, there are the thoughts, a sadness you didn't feel the night before, a brief anger that comes and goes like wind, a regret that doesn't belong to you. You sit with it, you carry it, and sometimes as you walk the lanes between villages, you find yourself whispering prayers for people whose faces you can't quite recall. It's as if the sins you've eaten leave an imprint, not sharp, not obvious, just there, settled beneath your ribs, tucked behind your eyes, lingering. There are other signs, moments of stillness that last too long, moments when you forget your own name, but remember the names of the dead, moments when laughter in a distant house sounds like crying, moments when you look into a pool of water, and for just a second, you see someone else's reflection. None of it is frightening, not really, just different, like the world has shifted slightly, like the veil between this life and the next has worn thinner near your skin, and you wonder, did the sins really enter you, or are you simply changed by the act of being present for death? You don't know, you never will, but still you walk, you sit, you eat, you carry. Some sin eaters speak of a voice, soft, indistinct, like a lullaby hummed from another room. It never says words, it just is, comforting, in its way, as if the souls you've helped are not gone entirely, as if part of them stays with you, gently, gratefully, a memory, a blessing, a whisper of thanks, or perhaps, a warning. And so, in your solitude, you begin to change. You notice the world more. You see the way birds gather on rooftops before a death, the way dogs howl softly at certain windows, the way candles flicker before the last breath. You notice the way people hold sorrow in their shoulders, in their hands, in the corners of their eyes. You become a watcher, not out of habit, but because grief teaches silence, and silence teaches sight. Sometimes on the edge of sleep, you wonder what would happen if you stopped, if one day you refused the bread, turned down the ale, let the sin pass into the soil instead. Would the spirit rise in peace, or would it linger, unsettled, tethered to the earth by the weight of its unfinished story? You don't know, and that's why you never refuse. No matter how tired, no matter how hungry, no matter how alone, you always say yes, because maybe, just maybe, this quiet, thankless job is not punishment. Maybe it is mercy. Maybe the soul needs someone to say, I will carry this for you, even if no one else hears, even if no one else knows, even if the world forgets your name, you know, and that is enough. You lie down now, in the soft grass beneath the stars. You close your eyes. You feel the weight of the day begin to loosen. You think of the sins you've eaten, not with judgment, but with compassion, because every sin is a story, and every story deserves a peaceful end. Let me tell you a secret. For every loaf of bread eaten in silence, for every whispered prayer beside the dead, there's a story, not written in books, not kept in libraries, but carried in voices low and slow beside hearths and hedgerows. Because even when the sin eater was real, with worn boots and a rumbling stomach, the villagers still saw something else, something not quite of this world. They believed you were human, yes, but also something more, and something less, something caught in between. The stories always begin the same way. There was a man, a quiet man, who came only when death did. He didn't knock, he didn't smile, he simply arrived, and when the ritual was done, when the bread was gone and the prayers spoken, he vanished again, like mist at sunrise. Some said he walked with no shadow, some said his footprints left no mark, some said he knew the moment a villager would die, days before it happened. One story tells of a sin-eater who lived deep in the woods, alone in a hut made of willow branches. They say the trees bent toward his chimney when he cooked, that foxes never ran from him, that birds would fall silent when he passed, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He didn't age, they said, or if he did, it was in reverse. Another tale speaks of a woman sin-eater, rare, but not impossible, who ate the sins of a man so cruel that his evil took root in her soul. They say she grew pale, then thin, then began to speak in his voice. She wandered the moors at night, whispering apologies to no one. Some say she died young, others say she still walks there, a figure in black, leaving no trail. In one village they speak of a sin-eater who wept after every ritual, not from sadness, but because he claimed he could feel the regrets of the dead, that each bite of bread flooded him with memories, not his own, of broken promises, stolen coins and names never spoken again. He stopped speaking entirely, after a while, only nodded, ate, left. His grave was never found. Children as always had their own version of the tale. They said sin-eaters could see ghosts, that they spoke with crows, that their eyes changed color depending on the sins they had swallowed, pale for liars, gray for thieves, black for murderers. One child claimed to see a sin-eater's reflection, moving on its own, just slightly slower than the man himself. In some places it was said that a sin-eater who died without confession would carry all the sins he ever consumed into the afterlife, a terrifying thought. And so in certain towns, a priest would follow the sin-eater secretly, hoping to catch him at his weakest, and convince him to confess before death came. But most sin-eaters died alone, quietly, without last words, their sins and those of hundreds of others, buried with them in the earth. There's a tale from a craggy Welsh coast, a fisherman's town, where waves crash like bells against black stone. They say a sin-eater once performed a ritual during a thunderstorm, and when he spoke the prayer, lightning split a tree behind the cottage. The villagers believed the soul had been released too quickly. They never asked him to return, and he never came back. Even the church, for all its frowns and warnings, had its own quiet fears. Some clergy believed that sin-eaters over time became corrupted, not morally, but spiritually, that eating the burdens of others twisted the soul, bent it, wore it down like water on stone, that too much darkness absorbed, could leave no room for light. Others believed sin-eaters were already damned, and thus could absorb sins because they had nothing left to lose. But there were brighter stories too. Some believed sin-eaters carried a piece of each soul, but not the burden, the memory, that by eating the bread and drinking the ale, they became a walking library of lost lives, that every sin-eater was a keeper of stories, that they carried not guilt, but grace, that if you sat beside one long enough, and listened as they slept, you might hear the voices of the dead, telling their side of the tale. Whatever the truth, the folklore clung to you like ivy. People feared you, respected you, needed you, but rarely understood you. And perhaps that's the mark of every myth, a figure both real and not, both man and mirror, reflecting the fears and hopes of everyone too afraid to face death alone. You are that mirror. You are the sin-eater, the one who walks into the stories others won't tell, and carries them away. In Chapter 9, we'll step fully into the day-to-day, not the ritual, not the myth, but the slow hours in between, walking, resting, waiting, the small quiet world of a person whose only job is to sit beside the dead, and then disappear. But for now, breathe. Let the myth settle into your chest like warm mist. Let the stories drift, like smoke above a hearth. You are the sin-eater, and even in legend, you are real. There are no clocks in your world, no ringing bells to tell you where to be, no list of names, no schedule to keep. You rise with the light, or sometimes before it, when the sky is still that soft blue-gray color, like a blanket someone forgot to fold. The air is cool, your joints are stiff, the ache in your legs is not pain, just memory. You stretch, you roll your shoulders, you pack your things, and then you walk. The day begins not with noise, but with steps, soft ones, boot to soil, boot to stone, boot to path. Your pack is light, a crust of bread, a knife wrapped in cloth, a small flask of ale or water, a strip of dried meat if you're lucky. There's no map. You know the roads by feel, the places where the lane curves by the stream, the trees that lean just a little too far west, the moss that grows only on one side of the old stone marker. These are your signs, and the crows too. They often follow, as if they know, as if they remember. You pass through a village before midday. People glance up, then look away. A boy drawing in the dirt with a stick, a woman hanging clothes who suddenly frowns at the sky, though no rain is coming. A dog that watches you with curious unblinking eyes. No one speaks to you, not directly, but you feel it. The air shifts as you pass. They don't need you today, so you keep moving. By noon you find a place to rest, a stump beside a field, a fallen log under a birch tree, a hollow by a ruined wall that's older than the oldest man you've met. You sit, you eat, you listen, to bees, to birds, to nothing. You drink, not to slake thirst, but to mark the hour, a ritual in itself. The middle of the day, the still part, the soft part. Sometimes you nap, sometimes you sharpen your knife, sometimes you carve symbols into the bark of trees, not for magic, but for memory. A crooked cross, a spiral, a line of dots. You'll know them when you pass again. If you pass again, in the afternoon you walk again, not toward anything, not away either. You follow the land. It decides. Sometimes it offers a shortcut. Sometimes it throws mud at your boots and laughs under its breath. You accept both, without complaint. Toward evening a chill arrives. You pull your cloak tighter. You find wood, dry, if you're lucky, and you make a fire. The first crackle always feels like company. You boil a bit of water, soften some bread in it, maybe throw in a wild herb or two, nettle, thyme, or something nameless that smells like lemon and dirt. You eat slowly. You don't speak, not out of solemnity, just habit. You think, maybe, about nothing in particular. A face you once saw, a story you heard, the way the moon looked last Tuesday. You remember the last family who called you, the one before that. You wonder if they're sleeping well tonight. You hope so. The stars come out like embers scattered across black cloth. You lie back, let the fire die down, let your limbs go still. You watch the sky until it feels like you're floating, and then slowly, you fall asleep. That's the day. Not dramatic, not tragic, not heroic, just quiet, just enough. Some days are colder, some longer, some easier, but most are just this: walking, listening, eating, waiting. There's a strange comfort in repetition. The world becomes a circle, no beginning, no end, just motion, just rhythm, like breath, like waves, like prayer. You've come to understand something most people don't. That slowness is not laziness. That silence is not emptiness. That solitude is not the same as sorrow. You live in the pauses, in the space between one ritual and the next, in the long thin stretch of time between lives and deaths. And in that space, you are more than a job. You are a witness, to the quiet, to the weight, to the world, turning gently beneath tired feet. In Chapter 10 we'll follow your final years. What happens when the calls stop coming, when age catches up, and the world moves on from sin-eating. But for now, lie back, let your arms go heavy, let your thoughts soften. The day is done, and so are you. You are the sin-eater. And tomorrow, the road begins again. The road begins again. The road begins again. The road.
The Norse world, runes, wraiths, and the whispering north wind. In the far north, where fords cut into rocky coasts, and the auroras shimmer in winter skies. The Norse people, Vikings of Scandinavia, lived by both axe and omen. Much of what we know of Norse superstition comes from sagas, Eddas, poetic lore, and later folklore. Here nights could be interminably long in winter, and the line between the natural and supernatural felt thin. The Norse had a robust mythology of gods, Odin, Thor, Freyja, and along with it an abundance of everyday beliefs that might strike us as wonderfully weird. Imagine sitting in a smoky longhouse with a family of Vikings as the wind howls outside. The fire in the center casts flickering shadows on the wooden walls carved with protective runes. It is in such a setting that we explore the superstitions of the Norse world. Norse superstition was intensely practical, often about survival, but couched in mystical terms. Consider their belief in land spirits, landvatter. Every region, forests, lakes, mountains, was thought to host its own guardian spirits. The Norse were careful to honor these spirits. In Iceland, which was settled by Norse voyagers, the first law code even declared that ships must remove their dragon-headed prows when nearing land, so as not to frighten the land spirits of the new country. Thus, a Viking ship returning home would take down its menacing carved dragon from the bow before entering harbor, as a sign of respect and a way to avoid supernatural retribution. Disturbing the local spirits could bring bad luck on one's farm or settlement. This reverence persists in modern Icelandic folklore, where people still politely avoid messing with certain boulders or hills said to belong to the Hulda-folk hidden people selves. But its roots lie in Viking Age beliefs that every natural feature had ears and eyes. To live in peace, one must not offend the unseen neighbors. The Norse were seafarers, and naturally many of their superstitions involved voyages and weather. Before a voyage, a Viking might observe the clouds and winds for omens. If the clouds in the east formed a shape reminiscent of Nithhogr, the dragon that gnaws at the world tree's roots, perhaps a storm was coming. The Vikings also believed in appeasing Ogre, the sea giant, for safe passage. There is mention in sagas that throwing some ale overboard as a libation to the sea could buy good favor. And if a sudden waterspout sea twister appeared, they might shout at it or try to cut it with swords from a distance, an echo of a belief that showing aggression could disperse hostile weather spirits. An especially eerie Norse belief was in the Draugr, the undead corporeal ghost often guarding treasure. People in the sagas who encountered a Draugr often had to resort to trickery or specific rites to put it to rest. One superstition said that if a corpse's eyes remained open, it would find someone to take with it, that is, cause another death. Thus they would close the eyes of the dead and even sometimes place a pair of scissors or iron on the chest of the deceased, as iron was believed to ward off revenants and malign spirits. This might be tied to a wider belief that cold iron is a bane to the supernatural, a concept that appears in many cultures. So iron nails or knives were often placed in thresholds or burial sites, as protective charms. Norse society also had seers and Velva sorceress, who performed Sather magic to see the future or affect outcomes. These practitioners followed certain superstitious forms. A Velva typically sat on a high platform during a ritual, often with a particular staff, and in some descriptions wore gloves of cat skin. The cat was sacred to Freyja, the goddess associated with Sather, so using catskin gloves perhaps was thought to channel her power. Ordinary folks attending such a rite might refrain from speaking out of turn or might hum along a specific chant called Varthalakkr, to raise the magic, believing that any disruption could invite ill-meaning spirits instead of helpful ones. Runes, the letters of the Norse alphabet, were not just for writing mundane messages, they were believed to carry intrinsic power. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson tells of a sick girl who was made worse because someone carved the wrong runes beneath her bed. When Egil discerns this, he burns the flawed runes and carves new ones correctly, saving her. From such tales comes the superstition, only the knowledgeable should carve runes, else one might inadvertently summon harm. Vikings often carved runes onto their swords or spears to imbue them with victory or protection. One famous inscription on a spear reads that the spear will strike true in battle, essentially an engraved spell. So widespread was this practice that some weapons with rune inscriptions have been unearthed by archaeologists. It shows that writing and superstition blended for a Norse warrior to scratch Tiwa's the rune of terror, a war god on his blade, was to invite Tyr's luck in combat. There was also a strong belief in omens from animals. If Vikings setting up camp heard a wolf howl nearby, they might take it as a warning from Odin, whose companions are wolves, or a sign to be on guard. Ravens were sacred to Odin as well. Seeing two ravens flying together, Hugin and Munin, in myth Odin's ravens could be interpreted as a positive sign that the Allfather watched over them. However, a raven croaking and veering away could mean Odin had withdrawn